This is our shoe texture practice. We're going to start with the canvas leather suede vinyl side. You're going to need an HB pencil, a darker B pencil, possibly a lighter B pencil, and an eraser. So I'm going to start with the canvas. First, since this is like a jean type of valued canvas, like a mid-gray, I'm just going to put down a layer of pencil and blend it first. If it was a lighter piece of canvas, like a white, I probably wouldn't do that first. But there are no right or wrong ways to do this. This is just how I've learned how to do it. I'm just blending with a tissue. You could also use a blending stump. Don't use your finger because you don't want to get the oils on the paper. So once I have that light layer, I'm going to start making some lines that look like cross hatching. So these lines are going to be a little bit darker because you can see like the weave of the fabric. I'm using the side of the pencil though because I want to keep those lines kind of soft. I don't want to go in with a really pointy pencil yet because I am going to keep blending. So I'm just going at a diagonal. I'm kind of looking at the angle of the fabric, the little weave of the fabric. And remember, as you're doing this, you're trying to get the impression of the texture. You're not going to get every little thread. You just want to have someone looking at it and being able to recognize it as a canvas texture. And then as I go along, I'm going to go the other direction. So I'm going at a diagonal and then going across. And then right now it doesn't look like much. But then I'm going to go back in, and if you look really close at this texture, you can see some darker lines. So I'm just kind of going in and with the tip of my pencil and scribbling in some lines. And this is sped up a little bit. But I'm trying to give the impression of those threads. You can kind of see as I'm shading it, I kind of do this little zigzaggy kind of line. And then I will go back over the other direction a little bit. Alright, so I'm taking a darker B pencil, and now I'm adding in some darker areas, because if you look at the texture, you can see there's some parts of it that are darker than others. So I'm going to try to add a little more dark values into my square. So as you can see, and this is sped up, this takes a bit of time. And then I'm adding some horizontal lines to also give that impression of the canvas texture. And again, you have to look at your example, your reference, and then see what lines are more prominent in yours. Since this is darker, I'm adding some more darker lines. I'm also using that's a mechanical pencil to add in some really, really fine detailed lines. So if you don't have a mechanical pencil, you can make the tip of your pencil just super, super sharp and do the same thing. So I'm going that one direction diagonal, and then I am crossing over it horizontal. And then I'm going back in. This is a gum eraser. I wish I had my little Tombow mono eraser, but I didn't have it. So I just cut off a chunk of the gum eraser, and just to add in some of those little light threads that you can see. So again, depending on how light your canvas is, you might need to do that a little bit more. Alright, next is leather. So leather's kind of crinkly. It almost looks like a reptile type of texture. So again, it also kind of depends on if you're working on really dark leather or if it's lighter. So for this one, I'm just doing a solid background. Very light though. I'm not using the tip of the pencil. I'm using the side. And then I'm going to blend it. And again, this is sped up. And then I make these little, I would call them mermaid tail, like fish scale lines. Just kind of as a guide, because as I'm looking at the shapes I see, they're kind of like these soft triangular type of shapes. So if you can do it different, you do not have to do it exactly the way I do it, but this is just how I started. And this particular piece of leather that I have zoomed in on has a really strong highlight coming from the side and not too many darker areas. So right now I'm just trying to shade those areas because you can see there's a shadow underneath where the texture is. So I'm trying to go around and create that impression. So I'm taking my darker B pencil, especially for those like areas right there that are dark, really bringing out the dark value underneath. And I'm shading really choppy. I don't know if you can tell, like in little lines, because if I look close, there's lots of little crinkles and wrinkles in the leather texture. So I'm trying to mimic that with my shading. Then I'm trying not to make the shadowing too thick on the other side, because if you really study it, you can see it's pretty minimal. It's very thin, but on the left side is pretty thick. So it's just, I'm just trying to follow the light. I'm going to take my kneaded eraser. I'm putting it up to a point. Again, I preferably would have wanted to use my Tombow eraser, but I couldn't find it. So I'm just pressing in and lifting up to kind of create some of those highlights. So I like to add into like a medium level and then erase back out. I'm adding some little tiny wrinkle lines in there. So I'm constantly putting in, taking out, putting in, taking out, and then adjusting. Alright, next is going to be suede. Suede is probably a little bit easier than the other ones because it's mostly flat. So I'm just going to lay down a value, a light value with the side of my pencil. I'm going to put in that little shadow mark from the side of the shoe. Again, still using the side of my pencil. I'm using a tissue. I'm going to go back in with my dark pencil, my 7B. I'm adding in the stitching. Then what I'm going to do is I'm doing these little tiny circles with my pencil. Very light pressure. I'm just kind of scribbling in little circles. Then I can see that there's like a darker portion of the suede and then some lighter portions. So as I get to the lighter portions, I lift up the pressure a lot more. But just lots of tiny, tiny little circles that overlap. So it's leaving some of that light value. You can see through it, but it's giving the impression of that kind of soft texture of suede. I'm just going back in with my eraser to add a little highlight on where the stitching is. And then I'm going to take my HB pencil, gum eraser, I'm using the tip. It's kind of like a mono eraser. Just add in a little bit of lightness back in there to create that texture. And there we go. There's some suede. Next is vinyl. So vinyl is a really smooth, shiny surface. So what I'm going to do is just outline the shapes I see and then fill it in with different values and smooth it out. So I think vinyl is probably the easiest because there really isn't a whole lot of texture like in leather or canvas where you have all these threads or all these creases. Vinyl is pretty slick and smooth, so you just have to make sure you really pay attention to the values that you see and the value shapes, and it's going to look good. For those darkest values, I'm just remembering to use that dark B pencil because I want to make sure the dark values are really dark. I'm just blending it here with a Q-tip. I didn't have any blending stumps at home, so a Q-tip works just fine. Just make sure when you're blending it, you can see how black that Q-tip is. Don't by accident mush all your values together into one value. So make sure you're using a clean stump or Q-tip. So I blend it and then I go back in with the pencil to create a really crisp definition on those reflections that I see. Since vinyl is really slick and smooth, I want it to look like that. So I want to blend it real smooth and then go back in and make sure any sharp edges are sharp. Okay, I'm going to carve out some of those highlights with a small eraser. I love to do reverse drawing. And then just finishing up, making sure that highlight those edges are really crisp, adding a little more value. There's some little detail shapes. Okay, we're going to do our next set of 4, starting with the eyelet. So the eyelet is the part where your laces go. It's usually metal. So I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'm just going to do the eyelet part with the lace coming out. So I'm just drawing my circle. I actually did not draw it in perspective correctly, but for this exercise it doesn't really matter. So this is almost just like shading a sphere. So I have that really nice shadow. And then there's a really deep shadow inside the eyelet, and then I'm going to do the shadow around it. And just these few values, if you get those values right, it's going to look really accurate. So then for those dark values, I go with my 7B. You can also use like a 4B or a 5B. I'm going to blend with my Q-tip to get a smooth surface. And then just really pay attention to your values as you do this. So I'm going to do this little, I kind of draw it in little waves back and forth to create the lace texture. So when you are drawing the eyelets on your shoes, make sure you're drawing your circle shape in correct proportion or perspective. So you can see mine's tilted the wrong way a little bit. It still looks fine. But if I was going to be doing a whole shoe of these, if one of them is off, you will be able to tell if it's too off. It's not in perspective correctly. So make sure you're practicing drawing circles in perspective to get it correct. And I'm just going to take my mechanical pencil or a really, really sharp point and highlight the bottom of some of that texture to really make it look like the light is coming from above. So I'm pretty much just drawing in those shadows right there. I'm just going to smooth out some of those shadows and then I'm going to call it good. If you want, you can draw the whole thing, but for my example, I'm just going to stick with the eyelet. Okay, next are laces. So these are medium gray kind of laces, so depending on the color, you might need to do things a little bit different. I'm just going to start by drawing the shape of the lines, so they're just really thick rectangular shapes. Then once I get that, then I'll start going in and shading. But always do the contour of the shapes first. Remember, think big to small. I'm going to take my Q-tip to blend. So if these were white laces, I would not do this part, but since they're more mid-gray, that's why I added the value first. So I'm going to go back in with my tiny eraser. And because I can see in the fabric or the texture of the lace, there's these little highlights that are kind of at a regular interval. So I'm just going to carve those out first. And then I go back in and do some tiny shading to kind of make the shadows around those shapes. So remember, you're just trying to create the impression of the lace. You're not going to be able to draw every tiny thread. So you just need to focus on where's the light, where's the shadow. Really look at value, and that's how you're going to create a realistic texture. You can see I'm adding these kind of straight like hatch lines. So I could see these diagonal lines that go through the lace. So I'm not doing really hard pressure on that. I'm just trying to give the impression. It almost looks like a diamond type texture. But I'm just really focusing on the values. So as I go along, I just keep adding value, adding value. So adding a little bit more value to some of those diagonal lines. Then blending where it needs blended. Then using my eraser to kind of bring back in any highlights I might have lost. So you're constantly adding, taking away, adding, taking away. And remember, we're just trying to capture the impression of this texture. Right, next to last we have stitching. So I'm just going to do that strip of stitching up there. So I'm going to draw out that contour of the shape. Since it is a middle gray, I'm going to add some value to the background and blend it. Now with stitching, depends on if it is white or black, but I start by studying the stitching itself. Are the stitches next to each other, or do they go back and forth? So for this, I'm taking that eraser that looks like a pencil, and then I made those little lines for where my stitches are going to be. So I used my pencil sharpener, I got a really sharp edge. And then now I'm using my pencil to shade underneath the stitch. So you have to really study, where's the light coming from? Where's the light value? Where's the dark value? But even just by doing this, it's going to give the impression of a stitch. So I have the shadow underneath. So this pretty much is just three values. That background value, the darkest, and the light. But as I go along, I will add some more. So I'm using my regular HB, and I'm just shading in between those stitches, add a little bit more value since it was a little bit too light, but also paying attention to the stitches and making sure to leave those really light highlights. Alright, last is mesh. Mesh is kind of challenging because it's light with dark parts instead of the opposite of what I've been doing. So, and since this is like a dark gray black mesh, I'm going to fill my square with a middle value. Blend with the tissue. And I apologize, my paper got lower on my camera. I did not notice. And then I'm going to use my eraser. So I'm looking at the lines that are around those little black parts of the mesh. So I'm trying to figure out the direction they go, and they kind of crisscross. So I kind of carved those out. And then once I carve those out, then I start shading in the center. So you can see I'm rounding them. And then I start shading in between them. So I can see there's a shadow that kind of creeps up from the left corner. So when I shade, I'm just going over the top of the pattern I'm drawing. And I'm doing this kind of fast. So in retrospect, I probably would have taken a little more time to make my lines more regular, because some of my little mesh pieces are larger than the others. But for my first try drawing mesh, I think I did okay. So I'm adding in some lines to mimic the little shadows and nooks and crannies that I see in the mesh. And then just as I go along, I need to make things darker and make them darker. Go back in with an eraser if necessary. Remember, we're just trying to give the impression of that texture. Then adding just a little bit more shadows in there. And then you can also blend over the top lightly so you can still see what you've drawn underneath. Alright, well, we are just about done. So good job. Once you're finished, just check off with me and I can give you some feedback. Can't wait to see what you've done.